Luc, off you go.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, much appreciated, and glad to be here. I'm speaking on behalf of the same organization that Susan Joyce actually spoke about yesterday. So it's the Social Practice Forum, and just by way of an introduction, this is I'm not going to repeat this, but basically we're a group of 65 practitioners. We are human rights practitioners, we are social performance practitioners. And it's a mix between consultants and human rights directors or social performance directors within companies. And then we have a few people that come from the academic background. And basically what we're trying to do is to push the needle a little bit. We are, on a day-to-day basis, we can even compete with each other over the same kind of assignments. But what we all share is that we're collectively quite frustrated by the fact that we are having access to senior management teams, as CEOs, of companies largely in the extractives. But that, of course, sometimes we feel that it is much better to actually drive the message home from a group of people. So that's what we're doing. And so what we're doing is these kind of events, but also bring out a number of tools and a number of deliverables, of which I'm going to make a blatant pitch today. And that's about FPIC. So as you mentioned, Sarah, there is a bit of confusion internationally about, what is on the one side FPIC 7. You got the lender saying you need to do FPIC. We see it in the newspapers. We see it on their website, FPIC, and then there is a lack of clarity still what FPIC actually means and how it relates, for example, to UNDRIP and what's expected from companies. Then at the same time, you have companies that say, well, I want to do the right thing. I am an ICMM member, for example. I subscribe to position statement on indigenous peoples. I would like to be aligned with the performance standards. Some companies have UNDRIP in their internal standards. But what the heck does it really mean? Because it tells me what I need to do, but there doesn't seem to be a great clarity about how it actually works and how I need to implement it in the field. And then you go to the field and, we deal with it all the time, of course. You find yourself in a situation where a host government says, indigenous people, really? Really? We're all indigenous. We don't have indigenous peoples. Or you have, particularly in places like Africa, where the government, Tanzania is a good example, where the government has made a real effort to make sure that tribalism and differentiation between tribes is really kind of, it becomes more like a we are all part of the same country, and tribalism is really kind of systematically diminished in importance by various government policies. And therefore now we come in representing a company and we say, well, by the way, some people are extra special, right? So those people actually get some extra authority and have a right to actually be consulted and ultimately to provide their consent. And of course, that becomes even more complex when the government is a joint venture partner and says, hell no, we don't do that. Or alternatively, when you have a situation where more tribes or groups or ethnicities say, well, we still have a tussle about whose traditional land we're actually talking about. So you have a situation some places in Latin America, for example, or Central America, where not only does the government not recognize indigenous peoples, but at the same time, indigenous groups themselves are not really clear about the traditional land, and therefore it becomes difficult for a company to say, well, what are we actually talking about, and how do we do it? So if I get to the next slide, I'm just a technological disaster here. Yes. So then you get internally in the company, to make it even more complex, you have people that say, well, really, so we have a local tribe here, 500 people, 1,000 people. And are we going to, what does consent really mean? Is it 51%, or are we going to figure out how people actually themselves determine consent? And at what point do we actually make that decision? So the company really feels on the one side pulls in the direction that our corporate office and the lenders and their standards say, you must do this, FPIC, and a recognition of indigenous rights in particular circumstances, obviously. And on the other side, you get the government that says, well, not so fast, please. Now, the company then, and that's where we come in as social practitioners, we then get hired by these companies to say, now, what do we do? And that's an interesting space, because the company says, well, I can't really wait until everybody has figured out what FPIC really means, and in what circumstances, and what is the definition, and how much is enough. And we also can't wait until the government actually makes up its mind. So the company deals with a lot of questions, very practical questions. And these are real questions. It is not hypothetical. And it also is not something, sorry, let me go back. That is also, something that I can't wait. So what we did as a social practice forum is to collect those experiences. We are not pretending to be the group that will say, well, this is FPIC and this is not, this is what it is and this is what it's not. This is what it's not. What our contribution, what we've tried to do, is to actually gather our experiences from our practice, from our social practice, from the companies we're working with. And what we have done in a primer is to basically collect experiences of how companies are dealing with these dilemmas on a day-to-day basis. How do they determine when free is really, how do you demonstrate that when free is free? How do you demonstrate that prior is really prior? What does informed really mean on the ground? And how on earth are you going to demonstrate the consent? And what does that mean in a particular situation? Because of course, this is very context specific. There is no one way to slice this. So the primer, that's what I'm talking about, is available on our website, and basically is a tool that hopefully will enable other companies or other practitioners to say, this is actually a helpful way of thinking about some of these very practical dilemmas, right? And it may, in some cases, be a way by which you say, well, it doesn't really fit my context, but at least I get a few ideas about how I can frame it inside the organization about what we need to do, or alternatively, how I can actually develop approaches to tackle these issues. And again, there is no value judgment here. It's a living document. And we would also invite everybody to provide alternative examples of experiences we have gathered, or alternatively to reach out to us and to say, this is a particular question that I have come across. Is there a group of people within the social practice forum? Can I drop it into the forum? Allow our members to actually chew on that question and see if they have any kind of practical experiences that address that particular challenge. And then hopefully over time, we will increase the robustness of this tool and continue to learn as a community of practice in terms of how we can do this. So that's the pitch. This is that's the tool. It's on our website. We're still fairly young. We have two deliverables. We have one is this very practical approach towards how to address FPIC related questions. We have another document that talks about competency framework. We've found that many companies are still kind of in an early stage of developing or determining actually what does it mean to be a competent social practitioner. And then we have a number of what we have called SP 101 papers. They will be out shortly, and that really is kind of aiming to clarify what is actually a difference between external affairs and social performance. Simple things like, what's the difference between having a chat and strategic stakeholder engagement? At what point do you start actually engagement? So we have a series. I think there's 12 of those that will be made public shortly, and will be we hope that they reach a broad audience. And again, it appeals to that common desire that we have as practitioners to kind of demystify some of these misconceptions in our idea, and also to respond to the I would say a bit of a frustration that we've had over the last 10-15 years, that some things simply need to stop. We talked in the session before, was really interesting to hear about issues about social investment and charity and philanthropy. Some of those practices we know work. We also know that some of those practices do not work and actually can create a lot of conflict. So what is it in social investment and engagement and grievance mechanism and resettlement that we need to demystify and to say, this is actually working, this is not working. So that's the high level pitch. And yeah, we'll be looking forward to any suggestions and piece of feedback.
Perfect. That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Luc. So ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together from your side of those muted microphones. A wonderful thank you very much for Luc. Brilliant. So I think that's something there where things like license to operate, FPIC, etc. It's always really complicated to be able to, or difficult to explain that to somebody like an engineer, because it's not like a tangible thing you can grab hold of. Is that correct, Luc, or am I just still missing the point?
I would say that if you want to talk about social license to operate, it's actually pretty straightforward to talk to an engineer. But I think you have a really good point that we as practitioners often don't speak the language of the engineering organization we're into. But there are very simple tools, of course, in terms of how do you measure this stuff? Well, if you do a risk assessment and you see that as part of your initial social risk, and you do a follow-up risk 6 months later, and for example, you are seeing that your risk exposure has decreased due to your engagement, that would be one way to say, well, this is how you measure effectiveness. But if you talk in terms of the value of engagement, the way we often do it is to say, this is really about making sure that you maintain the value of the asset, right? This is engagement. If you don't do engagement, this allows you to actually manage your contextual risk exposure. And I think the main issue with many people outside, or many of our colleagues, whether they're lawyers or accountants or engineers, there's often still, I think, a bit of a misconception about the fact that anything social is unpredictable, right? So you go into this black box, and well, I don't know whose grandmother was fighting with whose grandfather 10 years ago, and therefore things come out of the blue. Whereas of course, we all know things never come out of the blue. There is a very predictable pattern, and the pressure cooker keeps building up, and then all of a sudden you get a trigger moment, and you get the spark, and all of a sudden you got people moving to the gate, and the general manager says, well, where does this come from? Well, it wasn't that you run over that chicken or that you fired, there was a trigger event, but it is the predictability that I think we all need to focus on, to say human behavior is very predictable. And the manifestation of, if the manifestation of poor company-community relations is different in Pakistan than it is in the UK or in Nigeria. But the underlying patterns are exactly the same. And if you keep focusing on those underlying patterns, then in fact it becomes as predictable as going to a mountain and drilling a hole in the ground and all of a sudden find some ore, which for me is like mind-boggling. And an engineer would say, it's very predictable. You follow process 1, 2, 3, 4. So we often kind of, when we talk about it with our members, it's often about, helping managers connect the dots and to say, let's demystify it. This is actually very predictable, and this is how it plays out. Yeah.
So Luc, there's a really nasty question that's come in for you, but it's from one of your co-speakers, Maria. So I'm gonna dump you in it because it's a brilliant question, by the way. So she says, okay, so if human behavior is so predictable, why are we still struggling so much to liaise with communities where we do mining or oil and gas, etc.?
Oh, well, it's a really good question, because it's the same question it's a brilliant question. I think it's multifaceted. So there is I think the reason why we're still struggling with it, let me put it this way. 15 years ago, when we said we don't know how to establish relations with communities, some managers would have had a point. By now, we know there's predictability, and it often is about a very simple concept. And I would say there's maybe only 3 key elements. It's about transparency and predictability and how you distribute your benefits. It's about being seen as taking responsibility for your impact, whether it's influx management, it's your environmental management. And then there is this whole notion about being seen as a caring and respectful company. And of course, the engineer is saying, really, caring, responsible and respectful. I can't do anything with it. It doesn't fit into a spreadsheet. But of course, we all know if we go to the community and we say, what are the 5 or the 10 things that we need to do to demonstrate to you, community, that we are a caring company and that we are respectful, they will get back to us with really practical examples, right? So if we have a question, give us an answer, right? Don't, because for us it goes into a black box. If we have a complaint, don't send us a clerk, send us a decision maker, right? Involve us in decisions that affect our lives, right? Don't determine for us who is a local employee and who's an outsider, because your definition of local may be different than our definition of local. So pay your bills on time, which is unfortunately still not always the case, right? Tell your drivers to behave when they drive and they don't race through a community, so that we are really upset that we, from a safety perspective. So it is really kind of, it is going back to the community and bring that information back to the leadership to say, this is actually getting it right, and establishing good relationship is not rocket science. It is really following a series of steps that we all know. And I think it is providing that feedback to management to say, this is how you manage your social risk. This is, if you don't do it, you roll the dice. And if you roll the dice, you may be lucky and you roll a 6, but if you're unlucky, you roll a 1. If you don't have a mechanism in place to manage that, you basically are rolling the dice. So that's not a complete answer, but that's the first attempt.
That was brilliant, Luc. And I think that list of examples that you just gave in terms of, if we've got a problem, don't send a clerk, send a decision maker, things like that. It's those things that are so valuable to people of the kind of the broader working world. So that was absolutely brilliant. One final question, if I may, before we then switch gears quite considerably and we start looking at tailings. And this one comes in from Julie, and she asks, are there any resources available similar to the FPIC primer that look at how to define, assess, monitor, etc., broader community support? And I'm sure there are many out there, but I don't know if you've got a favorite.
Well, it's a really good question, because in fact, there are not many. This is something, in fact, we have a session in a few days from now with a major mining company that's actually exactly asking that question. So there are a number of tools, and they are typically implemented by consultants. And some of them are members, like, there's a number of tools to actually measure that. They're quite scientific in terms of surveys, and it requires consultants on the ground, at least the ones that I'm aware of. I think one of the challenges that we have as social practitioners is that we haven't cracked that nut, frankly, in a way that is actually accessible for those organizations that don't have deep pockets. So I think there's a real need, at least not that I'm aware of. So we need to get to a point where the question that we keep talking about is, if -5, if you look at the scale from -5 to +5, and you say +5 is really socialized and we embrace you, and -5 is get out of town now, and 0 is we barely tolerate you, how do you measure where you sit on that spectrum, right? Because if I go to a site and I say to a general manager, how are you doing? Where on the spectrum do you sit? Do you sit on +4 or -1? They typically, there's an awfully long silence to say, well, we think we're doing okay, but we can't measure it. So I think there's a real need and an opportunity for anyone to basically provide us with provide a simple enough tool to basically measure where you sit and how you can actually track that without going through lengthy perception surveys and things like that. So it's a really good question and not a good answer. But I think collectively we need to keep working on that.
Brilliant. And I think that's something there where if people do have answers to Julie's question, etc., please do add them into chat. Panelists, please do feel free to answer them in the Q&A as well. So hopefully that should help you out, Julie. But ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the fantastic Luc and insight to FPIC. So thank you very much, Luc. Brilliant.